Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where silence weighs heavy and footsteps echo with dread. You stand alone on damp cobblestone, the morning mist curling around your ankles like uneasy spirits. In your hands, a blade, freshly sharpened. Behind you, a wooden block stained with the memories of men whose names no one speaks anymore. You aren't a knight, not a priest, not a merchant. You're something far more socially confusing. You're an executioner. A job with job security, sure, but also the distinct disadvantage of social exile, poor table manners, and the very real risk of losing your own head if you sneeze at the wrong moment. You probably won't survive this, let's be honest, but at least you'll do it with impeccable form. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, post your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward through the centuries, past torchlit alleyways and mildew-slick dungeon doors, into a chapter of history most people would rather skip, unless they're watching a certain type of movie or desperately trying to fall asleep. Executioners. The hooded figures, swinging axes or tying nooses, whose presence both terrified and fascinated medieval crowds. Despite the gore-soaked stereotype, these figures followed codes, customs, and courtesies as complex and rigid as any royal court. Welcome to the surprisingly formal, dreadfully awkward, and endlessly misunderstood world of medieval capital punishment. First things first, executioners weren't just born into horror. Well, actually, sometimes they kind of were. But we'll save the family drama for later. What's important is how the whole concept of formal execution even came to be. You might assume people just hacked at each other wildly in the town square, and in the early days, you'd be kind of right. But as societies developed more refined legal systems, they realized something very obvious. If you're going to kill someone in public to make a point, you better do it properly. You can thank the Romans for that little revelation. They liked things orderly, even when it came to death. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and the same principle applies. An execution was a form of theater, a civic ritual. You needed someone to play the role of justice's instrument with just the right mix of menace and decorum. Someone who didn't flinch, didn't fumble, and, most importantly, didn't crack jokes mid-swing. By the time the Middle Ages reached full dramatic flair, around the 13th century, the role of the executioner had become a strange paradox, essential to justice, yet repulsive to society. You were needed, paid, even protected by law. And yet, everyone acted like you were contagious. You walk into a tavern? Silence. You buy bread? The baker drops it on the counter and takes 2 steps back. You offer a friendly good morning? A woman clutches her child like you just coughed in Latin. Why the hostility? It wasn't just the bloodstains, though those didn't help. It was the belief that your touch, your tools, even your breath carried spiritual pollution. Executioners were unclean in both the religious and moral sense. People feared not just what you did, but what you represented, a walking, talking reminder that justice had a dark side. That sometimes, mercy wore a black hood and smelled faintly of iron. Still, etiquette mattered. Even for you. especially for you. You couldn't just swing an axe and call it a day. You had to conduct yourself with ritual precision. From the way you stood on the scaffold, to how you addressed the condemned, to how many times you bowed to the crowd, yes, really, each gesture was loaded with meaning. For instance, you were expected to remain stone-faced. Not out of stoicism, necessarily, but because grinning while decapitating someone was considered poor form. Even in medieval France, where people threw cabbages at everything. And if you ever showed up late or drunk, you risked execution yourself. Irony was not lost on medieval judges. Historians still argue whether the elaborate public executions were more about justice or spectacle. Was it truly about law enforcement, or just a bloody excuse for entertainment? After all, these events drew crowds bigger than most religious festivals. Kids came. Merchants set up stalls. Minstrels composed catchy tunes like 3 swings and a prayer. Okay, that one I made up. But you get the idea. And don't let the Black Hood fool you, it wasn't always required. In some regions, executioners preferred to show their faces. Mostly because it made breathing easier, but also to demonstrate that they stood by their craft. The hood, when used, was less about anonymity and more about symbolism. You didn't want people to see you so much as the role you played, death's clerk, in a very grim office. Curiously, some executioners even developed local fan bases. The paradox deepens. Imagine being hated in church, but cheered in the marketplace. Kids whispering your name like a ghost story, yet begging their parents to go see the hangman this weekend. You lived in a weird in-between space, half monster, half celebrity. Sort of like a medieval version of a reality TV villain. Except you didn't get voted off. You just waited for the next execution. And when you were working, you were still under strict social guidelines. You couldn't sit on the same benches as regular folk. In many towns, you had to announce yourself with a bell or whistle as you walked through the streets, like a morbid ice cream man no one wanted to buy from. One French tale tells of a German executioner who, to gain acceptance, became an amateur herbalist. People wouldn't shake his hand, but they would knock on his door at night for help with gout, toothaches, and love potions. Apparently, decapitating someone gives you excellent knife control for minor surgeries. And that's where we leave you now, standing on the edge of your new career, blade in hand, stomach uneasy. You're not just killing. You're performing. You're upholding a code, twisted though it may be. So straighten your spine, wipe that nervous sweat, and remember, it's not personal. It's just etiquette. You don't really apply for this job. There's no parchment resume, no noble endorsement, no cheery town crier announcing your internship. Instead, you sort of stumble into it. Or, more accurately, you're shoved. Probably by fate. Or by a judge who doesn't want to get his hands dirty. Imagine, you're just a regular peasant, maybe a butcher's assistant or a guy who sweeps out the stables. One day, someone important asks you to carry out a sentence. Just once. Just this one time. And for reasons you don't quite understand, you say yes. You swing the sword. The man dies. The crowd gasps. And then, nothing. Well, not nothing. People stop looking you in the eye. Your cousin starts sitting farther away at dinner. the baker starts forgetting your order. One execution, and suddenly you've become that guy. This is how many medieval executioners began their careers, not as professionals, but as reluctant volunteers. Sometimes criminals were offered a stark deal: carry out executions or face one. Other times, debtors or social outcasts were coerced into the role just because no one else wanted to do it. It's like being promoted to manager when everyone else quits, except your job involves axes and high-stakes decapitation. Historians still argue whether early executioners were truly appointed or just sort of stuck in the position. There are stories of towns dragging in travelers, outsiders, vagabonds, anyone not tied to local families, and bribing them to take up the post. Think of it as an extremely dark version of jury duty, with fewer snacks and a much higher chance of public vomiting. Once you're in, though, you're in. Like mafia-level commitment. Your first execution brands you, socially and spiritually. Forget changing careers. No one will hire the guy whose hands have touched a severed neck. Not even to clean chimneys. You don't become a hangman by ambition. You become one because the world needed someone else to carry the burden, and they decided it should be you. After that, it's all about survival. Not physical, necessarily, although that's not guaranteed, but social survival. You begin walking differently, speaking more carefully. You learn when to nod and when to stay silent. You develop a quiet, eerie grace, not because you're naturally elegant, but because people expect it. No one wants their local executioner to be clumsy or chatty. Training? You're lucky if someone shows you how to sharpen the blade without cutting your own toes off. Most of what you learn by doing. Or, in the worst cases, by redoing. The first few attempts are rarely clean. Bones are tricky. Spines are weird. Sometimes the condemned flinch at the wrong moment, or you misjudge the swing, and things get messy. One German account from the 14th century tells of a novice executioner who took 7 strikes to fully decapitate a thief. The crowd rioted. Not because they cared about the thief, but because the etiquette had been broken. An execution was meant to be fast, symbolic. Not a slapstick horror show. From that moment on, your job is as much about dignity as death. You begin practicing your swing alone, late at night, chopping logs and sides of meat. You whisper apologies to the condemned. You start dressing a little sharper, pressed tunic, polished boots, as if that makes you less terrifying. And then comes the moment you realize you're not just a person anymore. You're a role. A walking symbol of consequence. People see you and think of punishment, of fear, of endings. You're a one-man memento mori, remember you must die, but with a side hustle and crowd control. Quirky fact, some early executioners tried to rebrand themselves by taking up side jobs. A famous one in Bohemia became a part-time dentist. Another in Poland worked as a traveling healer, charging less than the village priest and occasionally accepting payment in live chickens. Whether this was charming or disturbing is still debated. The irony? Despite all the fear and hatred, you're protected by law. In most medieval cities, harming an executioner was considered a serious crime. Because if you mess with the guy who kills people for a living, you're basically inviting chaos. Plus, they really didn't want to hold auditions for replacements. You start getting used to the rhythm of your new life. The strange blend of respect and revulsion. The nods from city guards. The whispered prayers as you pass through town. Children stare. Dogs growl. Churchgoers cross themselves as if you carry the devil in your pocket. And maybe you do. A small, clinking, metaphorical devil. But you also learn something oddly human. Most of the people you execute, they're not monsters. Some stole bread. Some muttered against the king. Some were just in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong face. And it's your job to end their stories with what little grace you can muster. You're expected to look them in the eye and say nothing cruel. Sometimes, you offer them a final sip of wine. Sometimes, you adjust the ropes or quietly reposition their feet so their final moment isn't worse than it already is. These aren't written rules. No one teaches them. But you learn, through repetition and guilt, what small mercies are possible. And then, then you go home. Back to your slightly crumbling house on the edge of town, the one everyone avoids but everyone knows. You clean your tools. You sit down. Maybe you eat. Maybe you drink. Maybe you just stare at the wall until it stops looking like a crowd of faces. You don't choose this life, but you begin to wear it like a second skin. And deep down, in the quiet moments, you wonder, how many executions does it take to stop dreaming about the first one? You didn't just inherit the tools, you inherited the whole lifestyle. The gallows doesn't just stand in your backyard, it runs in your bloodline like bad knees and questionable taste in hats. That's right. Welcome to the family business. You'd think no parent would want their child to grow up to be a professional killer with a social life flatter than a wagon wheel. And yet, medieval executioner families often pass the job from one generation to the next, like a particularly cursed family heirloom. You don't just become an executioner, you become the executioner. Junior. Then senior. Then old Hangman Joe until your grandkid takes over and repaints the axe handle. It's not because your parents hated you, probably. It's because, once marked by the profession, your family became a closed loop. Outsiders wouldn't marry in. Towns wouldn't let you move out. So your options were pretty limited. Teach your kids to chop necks cleanly, or risk them becoming chimney sweeps with worse odds of survival and fewer moral ambiguities. Historians still argue whether these family lines stayed in power because of legal contracts or social force. In many cases, it wasn't formalized in writing. But the message was clear, no one else wanted the job, and your family already knew where the ropes hung. Why train a stranger when Junior was already sneaking into the gallows yard with his wooden toy sword? You remember your father's hands, thick, calloused, careful. He never raised his voice, but he didn't need to. When he taught you how to clean the axe, he didn't talk about death. He talked about precision, about dignity, about making sure the town's dirty work looked clean from the second row. He never smiled, but sometimes, just sometimes, he patted your shoulder after a quiet afternoon of practice. Your mother didn't carry a blade, but she carried the weight of the roll in every sideways glance and every closed door. She taught you how to navigate the markets without touching the produce, how to trade coin with a glove on, how to pretend not to notice when the priest skips your pew during blessings. It wasn't just your parents. Your cousins knew the steps. Your uncles had stories. Even your baby sister learned to walk around the bloodstains with perfect little tiptoes. You didn't have bedtime tales, you had execution records. Once upon a time, in Nuremberg, a thief was hung for pinching a silver spoon. The crowd was unruly, but your great-grandfather bowed twice and kept the news steady. Sweet dreams. You try dating once. It does not go well. You meet a girl from the neighboring village. She smiles when you say hello. Then she asks your name. You tell her. Her face freezes like a pond in winter. She mumbles something about chores and disappears before your next blink. Eventually, your family stops trying to blend in. You were black not just for drama, but for practicality. Bloodstains don't show. You live near the edge of town, where the wind carries fewer rumors. You learn to entertain yourselves. Card games. Knucklebones. Boiled meat and sour ale and a surprising amount of chess. It's not all grim. There's a strange kind of closeness in executioner families. You talk about things no one else understands. You share quiet jokes. Like the one where your uncle drops a melon and says, "Guess that one's guilty." You all laugh. It's dark, yes, but it's yours. One fringe tradition, almost too bizarre to believe, claimed that in parts of Hungary, executioner families were forbidden from entering churches, but were invited once a year to sweep the aisles as a form of penance. Whether or not they actually swept or just loomed ominously with brooms remains up for debate. But the biggest lesson you learn is about trust. In a family of executioners, you trust each other in ways no one else can. When your brother tightens a rope, you know it won't slip. When your aunt hands you the executioner's sword, you know it's been sharpened just right. You're bound by duty, yes, but also by an unspoken agreement. If the world won't have you, at least you have each other. Sometimes, other families try to challenge your claim to the role. Maybe a town thinks it's time for a change, or an ambitious rival wants a piece of your niche monopoly. But they usually back down. Because your family has experience. Your family has stories. Your family has reputation. And reputations in this line of work, they go a long, long way. You begin teaching your own child, reluctantly, gently. You hope they won't have to do what you do. But what choice will they have? The role wraps around your family like ivy around a stone tower. There's no way out that isn't painful, permanent, or pathetically impractical. So, you lean into it. You shape your child's hands, teach them the balance of a sword, the knot of a noose, the slow patience of poison, just in case. You tell them it's not about death. It's about duty. And if they're going to carry the name, they better do it with straight posture and clean boots. You know they hate it. But they'll thank you someday. Maybe. Until then, the gallows creaks, the townsfolk whisper, and your family name continues to echo, not in glory or disgrace, but in necessity. There's something quietly humiliating about needing your own butcher. Not because you're squeamish, you, of all people, can handle the sight of blood, but because the town butcher won't sell to you. He says he's out of stock, even when you can see the pork dangling behind him like pink laundry. So now, you trade discreetly with travelers or raise your own livestock on the edge of the woods. Because when you're the executioner, even your dinner becomes an exercise in social exile. This is what it means to be a necessary pariah. You walk through the market square and people part like water around a stone. Some pretend not to see you. Others cast furtive glances, like you're a weather omen or a ghost they haven't decided whether to believe in. Children point until their mothers hush them. You're not a person to them. You're a walking consequence. In many towns, laws were written specifically to remind everyone just how much they didn't want to be you. Executioners were banned from entering public bathhouses, forbidden from eating in taverns, barred from marriage with honest citizens. Your rights were carefully shaved down like the condemned man's beard, ceremonial, minimal, and mostly for show. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were meant to punish or protect you. On one hand, they preserved the illusion that justice was pure and clean, untainted by the man wielding the axe. On the other, they kept you from being lynched by angry mobs who didn't like the verdict. After all, if people think you are the punishment, they might come after you instead of the judge who handed down the sentence. So you live on the fringes. Physically, emotionally, architecturally. Your house is at the edge of town, near the swamp or the gallows hill. Not because it's scenic, but because no one wants you closer. Even the road that leads to your front door seems to tiptoe. Inside, the walls are thick with silence. You don't get many visitors. Except the condemned, of course. And they're not much for conversation. You develop odd routines to fill the days between executions. You fish, mostly catch and release, ironically. You carve wooden toys you'll never give to children. You practice calligraphy with your left hand just to prove you can still make something beautiful. Every now and then, a priest visits. Not to bless the house, it's beyond that, but to deliver last rites or paperwork. He leaves quickly, often without accepting your offer of tea. And honestly, you don't blame him. Sometimes the town pays you in money. Sometimes in strange bundles of goods, firewood, flour, candles. Once, you were paid in cabbages. 6 whole sacks. You didn't even like cabbage. But you boiled them anyway, week after week, until the very smell of your kitchen was enough to drive mice into neighboring homes. Quirky fact, in some regions, executioners were the only ones allowed to handle dead bodies that had been corrupted, murder victims, suicides, plague corpses. So you became a kind of grim janitor, cleaning up when death got too messy for polite society. Your hands, skilled as they are, never receive praise. There are no festivals in your honor. No saints bearing your name. No plaques. Just a long, quiet string of people avoiding eye contact. One day, a man walks past you without flinching. Just nods. Like you're anyone else. It's such a shock, you nearly forget your basket of fish. You don't even know his name, but for a moment, the sun seems a little warmer. Another day, a child leaves a small flower on your doorstep. It's wilted and lopsided, probably plucked from someone's private garden. But still, you don't touch it. Just let it sit there, like an alien visitor. The next morning, it's gone. Carried off by wind or guilt or someone else's boot. Despite the isolation, your presence is expected at every execution, rain or shine. They won't sit next to you at church, but they'll absolutely come out to watch you work. You are essentially excluded and exclusively essential. A walking contradiction with a hood and a deadline. People gossip about you constantly, but rarely to you. They invent stories, sordid, strange, often supernatural. One tale claims you speak fluent Latin because the devil taught you. Another says you sleep upside down like a bat. You don't even correct them anymore. It's easier to let the myths flourish. They act as a buffer. The more they fear you, the less likely they are to knock on your door asking for favors. And yet, paradoxically, people do come to you for favors no one else wants to grant. A pregnant woman with no midwife in sight. A wounded traveler bleeding in the road. A widow with an animal to butcher but no strength to do it. They know you have the skills. They know you've seen worse. So they knock, quiet and desperate. And you answer, every time. Because you may be an outcast, but you're not cruel. One scholar once wrote that medieval executioners were hated in daylight and relied upon in darkness. You feel that. Deeply. You're the last call when everything else fails. The shadow that fixes broken things. The ghost that cleans up after tragedy. You try not to let it make you bitter. You succeed, mostly. You keep your tools clean. Your edges sharp. Your eyes forward. And at the end of the day, you sit quietly by the hearth, sip your cabbage broth, and remind yourself that dignity isn't about how people see you. It's how you carry yourself when no one's looking. You wake before dawn, not out of habit, but because the rooster knows not to crow while you're still sleeping. That's a joke, of course. Roosters don't care about your reputation. But you like to imagine they do. It's one of the little fantasies that keep you sane. This morning is a special kind of quiet, the kind that clings to the rooftops and wraps around chimneys. The kind that knows something's coming. An execution day. You feel it in your bones before you even pull back the shutters. The town feels tighter, like it's holding its breath. And in a way, it is. You wash your hands slowly. Not because they're dirty yet, but because it feels respectful. You check the edge of your sword, your scharfrichter blade. Double-edged, almost ceremonial. Heavy in the right places. You've wielded it with care, just as your father did, and his father before him. The blade is more than a tool. It's your stage partner. When you step into the square, it must shine. Because this isn't just justice. It's theater. Execution days are part ritual, part performance, and part, though no one admits it, public entertainment. People love a good hanging. Or a beheading. Or a wheel breaking if they're feeling particularly frisky. It's their version of drama. The stakes are high, the actor's real, and the consequences terminal. You arrive early to prepare the site. No one helps you, not because they aren't allowed, but because they don't want to. The scaffold creaks beneath your boots. You test the trapdoor, retighten the hinges, measure the drop. You set the stool where the condemned will sit, the blindfold within reach. Even the gallows has etiquette. There are rules, you see. A quiet code of conduct among executioners across the region. The rope must be new if the crime is serious. The blade must be freshly whetted. The executioner must not speak unless required. You're not there to perform a sermon. You're there to execute not just the person, but the task, the order, the ritual itself. Historians still argue whether these protocols evolved for moral reasons or just logistical ones. But they existed, consistent across towns and decades. A kind of dark professionalism. Then, of course, there's the condemned. Sometimes they're stoic. Sometimes trembling. Once, a man told you a joke seconds before the axe fell. You laughed. He didn't get to. You try not to look into their eyes. Not out of guilt, no, you've long made peace with your role, but because there's something unsettling about seeing acceptance. It reminds you of your own lack of choice. The crowd begins to gather. You can hear the murmurs, the shifting of feet, the rustle of skirts, and the low hum of curiosity. They love a spectacle. They complain if it's delayed. Some bring food. Others bring children. Once, someone sold roasted chestnuts at an execution. You don't know whether to find that disturbing or entrepreneurial. You keep your face still. A mask of grim professionalism. You are the instrument of justice, not its composer. The judge writes the score, you play the final note. When the moment comes, the town crier reads the charges in a loud, practiced voice. Theft. Murder. Treason. Heresy. Whatever it is today. You step forward, slow and deliberate. The crowd goes quiet. And then, you do the deed. Quick. Clean. No showboating. You're not here to amuse. Some days, it goes smoothly. Other days, less so. The rope slips. The sword catches on bone. The crowd gasps, but they never blame themselves for being there. Quirky fact, in some regions of Germany, if an executioner performed his duty especially well, say, a perfectly clean beheading, he was tipped by the audience. You once got 3 coins and a turnip. You still have the coins. You gave the turnip to your goat. After the execution, you stay to oversee the removal of the body. It's part of the code. Leave no mess. Leave no trace. The gallows must be cleaned by sunset. You walk home alone. No one speaks to you. No one thanks you. But the town is satisfied. For now. You wash again, this time until your skin tingles. You oil the blade, hang your coat, and sit by the window with a cup of weak ale. You watch the street from behind the curtain. The children play again. The butcher laughs again. The town moves on. And you remain quiet. Still. You did your job. You followed the etiquette. You were precise. You were professional. But you weren't invited to the tavern tonight. Or tomorrow. Or ever. That's the rule. And you follow rules very, very well. Let's talk gear. You'd think the tools of an executioner would be as grim as the job itself, just blades, ropes, and dark hoods. But your toolkit is far more elaborate than the average dungeon fantasy would have you believe. In your cottage, tucked at the edge of the woods like a secret best left undiscovered, you keep them arranged with obsessive care. There's a place for everything, and everything in its place. Not because you're tidy, though you are, but because these tools matter. They're your instruments, your orchestra, your professional pride. On the central table sits your sword, broad, double-edged, and designed specifically for beheadings. Contrary to popular imagination, it's not curved like a scimitar or decorative like a nobleman's rapier. No, your blade is heavy and straight, meant to end things with precision. And it doesn't even have a point, because stabbing is messy and, frankly, not your department. Historians still argue whether execution swords were always ceremonial, or if some were used in real combat. The consensus? They were mostly purpose-built. You don't duel with justice. You deliver it. Next to the sword is your whetstone. You use it constantly. Not just before executions, but often during the long hours between them. It's calming, like knitting, but louder. The steady shusha rhythm helps you think. Helps you forget. Helps you remember. Some days, it's all three at once. And then there's the rope. Hanging is trickier than it sounds. It's not just about throwing a noose over a tree branch and hoping for gravity to do the job. No. There's math involved. You have to calculate the drop carefully. Too short and the condemned chokes to death slowly. Too long and, well, let's just say things get unpleasant fast. You maintain different ropes for different body types. You weigh each condemned before sentencing, not out of curiosity but out of grim necessity. There's even a formula, length of drop multiplied by body weight divided by a number that sounds more like algebra than punishment. Quirky fact, there was an actual manual known as the Table of Drops in later centuries, used to standardize hanging procedures. Not medieval, technically, but the principle goes way back. You wouldn't want the crowd to be too horrified, after all. Just enough to make a point. And speaking of spectacle, let's not forget your collection of iron implements. You keep a branding iron for punishments less fatal but no less final. For marking thieves, mostly. A small circle on the cheek, a hot kiss of social death. No one talks to a branded man unless they're also planning to steal goats. Then there are shackles, various sizes, all uncomfortable. Stocks for public humiliation. Thumbscrews that you don't like using, but sometimes the bailiff insists. Your role isn't always death. Sometimes it's pain, or fear, or simply the presence of pain. You're like a living reminder that consequences are real. One corner of your home holds the cart you use to carry condemned prisoners. You clean it after every use. Thoroughly. Partly for hygiene, partly because dried blood is surprisingly hard to scrub out of oak planks. You've tried everything, salt, vinegar, prayers. Only the prayers fail you every time. There's also your cloak. Heavy, dark, and dramatic. Not for warmth, though it helps, but for image. You're expected to look like the embodiment of finality. The town needs to see death coming. Preferably in black wool, trimmed in silence. Your boots are reinforced with iron studs. Not for stomping, though they do echo ominously on the scaffold stairs. It's more about durability. And intimidation. You don't want to slip mid-execution, that would ruin everyone's day. Historians sometimes romanticize executioners as lone craftsmen, but the reality is much closer to bureaucratic necessity. You're the last stop in a long process of law. Your tools, however medieval they seem, represent something modern, process control. You keep meticulous notes. Not just weights and names, but dates, durations, public reaction. You log your blade sharpenings. You record hang drop calculations. You even sketch the occasional gallows layout when you're asked to build one from scratch. Yes, you build things too. Sometimes, the town hires you to construct a gallows or a pillory. You're good with wood, nails, and rope. You've developed a reputation for gallows that don't creak too much. Which, weirdly, is a compliment. You keep your materials in the shed behind the house. Lumber, nails, spare axles, a peculiar set of folding knives used once in a particularly complicated dismemberment case you don't talk about. Not because it haunts you, but because it involved tax law, and honestly, that's more disturbing. Even your medical knowledge has grown. You can locate major arteries. You understand pressure points. You've learned the difference between a conscious faint and a post-mortem twitch. There's no diploma on your wall, but in another life, you might have made a passable surgeon. Sometimes, you think about what your tools will become when you're gone. Will your sword be melted down into plowshares? Will your ropes be thrown on the fire, or quietly tucked away in some museum centuries from now, labeled gruesome relic? Will children peer at them through glass, their ice cream melting as they ask questions their parents won't want to answer? Or maybe your tools will pass to another, an apprentice, like you once were. You remember that day, how you first held the sword, too heavy for your young arms. Your master saying, "Hold it like it matters." You've never forgotten. Now you say it yourself, if anyone dares to listen. Because the tools do matter. They are not weapons. They are not toys. They are the last thing some people will ever see. And in a world where justice often wears a blindfold, you are the hand that holds the scales still, if only for a moment. You don't have friends. Well, not exactly. You have people who nod at you. People who tolerate your presence at a market stall long enough for you to buy onions. People who sometimes leave a bundle of firewood by your door without a word. But no one asks you how your day was. No one invites you in when it rains. If your house caught fire, the town might hesitate a little too long before fetching water. It's not personal. Or rather, it is, but in a way that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with your job. You're an executioner. You kill people for a living. And that makes you, by default, socially radioactive. You live in a designated area on the outskirts of town. Not because you want to be close to the frogs and the fog and the patchy sheep pasture, but because you have to. The law says so. Most medieval towns had specific zones for unclean trades. Executioners, gravediggers, tanners, lepers. Not exactly the neighborhood from your childhood dreams. Historians still argue whether the isolation was due to spiritual impurity, practical fear, or the town's desire to just not see the person doing their dirty work. Probably all three. You're not technically cursed, but you are touched by death. Which, in a time when plague and famine were all too real, makes you a walking reminder of what people want to forget. The townsfolk believe death clings to you, like the scent of blood or the shadow of guilt. Even when you're just buying cheese. You've heard children chant rhymes about you. Silly little things with poor meter and worse rhyme schemes. The man in black will take your head. So mind your words or you'll be dead. Creative. Heartwarming. One boy once ran up to touch her cloak and dashed off squealing like he dared the devil himself. His mother scolded him, but she didn't make him apologize. Still, it's not all gloom. There's the baker, who lets you pick your bread from the back where the other customers won't see. There's the herbalist, who doesn't flinch when your hand brushes hers while passing a vial of something bitter and green. And sometimes, rarely, you meet another executioner. That's when you feel something like community. There's an understanding there. A nod that says, yes, I know what it's like to be essential and avoided in equal measure. You trade stories, blades, techniques. You once met a man from Lubeck who swore by a particular kind of ashwood handle for his axe. He also claimed to have executed a goose for witchcraft, but that part was suspect. Executioners formed a loose network across regions. Like a guild, but quieter. You couldn't exactly hold monthly meetings, but you knew of each other. You recognized the calluses, the gaze that looks just past people, not quite at them. There were even family dynasties, executioner lineages stretching back generations. Sons inheriting not just the tools, but the isolation. A legacy of professional solitude. Quirky fact, in some regions, executioners had special permission to enter towns only under specific circumstances, often through side gates, and sometimes barefoot, to avoid contaminating the streets. You've walked barefoot more than you'd like to admit. Rain or shine, mud or frost. Because rules are rules. Your name is rarely spoken aloud in town. Not because it's forbidden, but because it makes people uncomfortable. You've seen it written in court documents, sure. But in conversation, you're just him. Or worse, the hand. The one who does what no one else will. You find small comforts in animals. Your dog doesn't care that you sever necks for a living. Your goats are more interested in your sleeve than your social status. There's a pigeon that insists on nesting in your roof every spring. You let her. She's never judged you. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, you imagine what it would be like to sit at the tavern, to drink and laugh with the blacksmith, to lean on the bar like you belong there. But you don't. Even if they let you in, which they won't, you'd feel the weight of every stare, every whisper. The knowledge that your touch, your presence, your voice, all carry the gravity of the noose. So, you stay home. You eat your stew in silence. You read the same 3 manuscripts over and over. One is about medicinal herbs. One is a poorly copied book of saints. The third is a collection of riddles, half of which make no sense. You love them anyway, because they don't care who you are. They just sit on your shelf, waiting to be read. You write sometimes, too. Not memoirs, no one would want to read those. But lists, observations, little notes about how people react when faced with death. You've noticed the bravest ones often tremble in their final seconds, and the quiet ones sometimes sing. You once executed a monk who whistled a tune as he climbed the scaffold. You still hum it when you wield your sword. And through it all, you endure. Because the town needs someone to do the job. And that someone is you. Not because you're cruel. Not because you enjoy it. But because someone has to carry the weight. And though the world keeps you at arm's length, You carry it well, even if no one ever says so. The scaffold waits in silence, just like you train it to. Every timber, every nail, measured, hammered, and checked twice. You built this one yourself, right in the town square, under the vague supervision of a sheriff who couldn't measure his own beltline, let alone a gallows beam. This one had to be special. The condemned is a nobleman. When that happens, and it does, more often than you'd think, everything becomes a performance. A message. A lesson. Your part in that message? Make it clean. Make it efficient. Make it unforgettable. You arrive at dawn, your cloak damp with dew and your boots already coated in the light dust of morning. No one greets you. But the scaffold does, quiet, sturdy, and slightly tilted eastward. You adjust a bolt. It's fine now. Today is hanging day. You've already measured the drop. The rope is cut to length, coiled neatly at the base of the beam like a snake waiting to strike. The noose is knotted with unsettling elegance. The knot? The hangman's knot, naturally. With its iconic 13 coils, it's more about tradition than physics, but tradition holds power. Especially here. Quirky fact, not all regions use 13 loops. Some preferred 11. Superstition varies wildly depending on whether the local priest is nervous or drunk. The platform creaks as you step up. You test it. Bounce once. Solid. You stand in the middle, gaze down at the crowd beginning to gather, spilling in like rats to crumbs. They murmur, jostle, whisper. Some look for the best view. Some look away. A few have brought children. Why do they always bring children? You know why. Fear is an inherited trait. The nobleman arrives in a cart, bound, gagged, wearing a doublet that probably cost more than your entire tool set. His face is pale but composed. He's used to commanding rooms. But here, you're the gravity. You're the center. He's just a falling object. He tries to meet your gaze, but you're already busy checking the trapdoor mechanism, testing the release lever, inspecting the knot one final time. You don't flinch. You don't smile. You just work. Historians still argue whether executioners took pride in their precision or simply dissociated to survive. The truth is probably a bit of both. You have to care about details, but you can't feel them too deeply. The bailiff reads the charges. Treason, theft, conspiracy. The usual. The crowd hisses at the right places, but there's little passion in it. This nobleman isn't their villain, just someone else's fall from grace. You help him ascend the steps. You support his arm, not gently, not cruelly, just efficiently. He smells like lavender and sweat. Wealth and terror. You place the noose. You adjust it with a practiced tug. You whisper something, just for him. Stand still. It's not a threat. It's advice. Wobbling makes things worse. And then the moment comes. You pull the lever. And he drops. The trapdoor claps shut. The rope twangs. The crowd gasps as one. A few scream. A few cheer. Most just watch. You watch, too. You count. 1, 2, 3. Waiting for the stillness. You've learned the signs of a clean break versus a slow death. This one? Clean. Merciful. If mercy exists here, you nod once. It's over. The body will hang until sunset. Another rule. More spectacle. More theater. It will be lowered, washed, and buried somewhere out of the way and not too deep. Nobles get slightly better graves than commoners, but not much better. Dirt is the great equalizer. You disassemble the scaffold in silence. You work alone. Always. You return the rope to your cart. You pack the lever, the beam, the bolts. No one helps. No one offers. You pass the crowd as they scatter like leaves before wind. They part for you instinctively. No one looks you in the eye. Except one boy. Maybe 7. Hair sticking out in tufts, eyes wide and unblinking. He watches you with the stillness of someone memorizing everything. He doesn't flinch. You pause. Then you move on. Later, you'll scrub the wood. The trapdoor needs sanding, it caught slightly on the edge. Not noticeable to the crowd, but you felt it. That's enough. Your standards matter more than theirs. You sit on your bench that evening, staring at the last light vanishing behind your garden. You sip something Mormon herbal. Your dog snores gently at your feet. You think about the nobleman. The way he tried to stay tall, even as gravity had other plans. You wonder if he remembered anything of the trial. Or if he only remembered the climb. You don't remember all their names. But you remember the sounds. The shuffle of boots. The whimper before silence. The thud. Always the thud. You sleep lightly that night. Not from guilt, but from habit. You always sleep like someone might knock at the door before dawn with another name, another crime, another scaffold. Because they usually do. And you'll be ready. You didn't ask for it, but they buried it with you anyway. Reputation. The kind that clings tighter than blood to linen, and no amount of lie or penance can scrub it clean. It's not about what you did, really. It's about what you are. And because of that, the rules of your afterlife are complicated. You die. One day, like anyone else. Maybe from fever. Maybe from a kick from a startled mule. Maybe from slipping while trimming a noose and falling into your own work. Oh yes, it's happened. And now the question becomes, where do they put you? You'd think someone who served the town so long, cleaned up their messes, risked disease from decaying bodies, would at least earn a small spot in consecrated ground. But you'd be wrong. You're an executioner. And even in death, you're still unclean. Historians still argue whether this spiritual exclusion was rooted more in religious doctrine or social convenience. Probably both. Church law in many places deemed that executioners, like actors and gravediggers, were too close to sin and death to rest among the pure. So your final resting place? It's likely at the edge of the cemetery. Or worse, outside the walls. A little mound where the weeds grow tall and the tombstones don't. There's a known burial site in Nuremberg. An actual executioner's corner. Not marked, not decorated. Just a place where the dead who handled the dead were allowed to rot. Quirky fact, in some Swiss cantons, people believed executioners' bones carried dark energy and had to be buried under iron nails to keep them from cursing the soil. A bit dramatic, maybe. But, hey, better safe than sorry. Your grave is shallow. Not from neglect, but from law. Deep graves were for those deserving eternal rest. You get just enough dirt to keep the dogs out. Sometimes, if you had a family, they bury you quietly at home. But often, you didn't. By the time your body stiffens, you've already outlived any kin willing to claim you. Still, your tools get passed on. Your sword, if you had one, is inherited like a family heirloom. Just one with more blood than polish. In some towns, the successor would take your blade and bury it upright in the ground before pulling it free, as if drawing it from the earth gave it new life. Some executioners left behind little books. Manuals, diaries, lists of names. You'd think those would be locked away. Instead, they were often burned. Just in case. Because what if your words had power? What if knowing too much about death made death notice? You get no final sermon. No tolling bell. Just a quick shovel, a few murmured words from a clerk who smells like pickled onions, and the wind to keep you company. The town goes on. The executions go on. And someone else wears the hood. You become a rumor. A half memory. A silhouette. Over the years, the scaffold rots. The square is paved. People forget the exact spot where you did your work. But they remember the chill. Kids say the grass still grows crooked where your gallows stood. That dogs won't sit there. That you can hear your boots pacing on windy nights. Folklore does you no favors. In some parts of Germany and Poland, the Nachrichter, a word meaning corrector of the night, was believed to return as a restless spirit if his body wasn't buried properly. So towns took precautions. A few smashed your skull, just in case. One less revenant to deal with. You never asked for a monument. But still, once in a while, some curious soul finds your name in the archives. Dusty parchment. Ink faded. But there it is. Executioner. 32 beheadings. 4 hangings. 2 drownings. 1 burning. They read your name, frown, and move on. You'd laugh, if you could. Because none of those numbers tell them the hours you spent preparing the rope. The sleepless nights before a triple execution. The way your hands shook the first time you held a blade with intent. And they'll never know the look on the prisoner's face when they mouth thank you just before the drop. Because it was a kindness. No matter how they remember you. And so you stay there. At the edge of town. Under the soil no one blesses. With a view of the hill where you once stood tall and silent. It's not a bad view, really. Just lonely. As always. You live on in whispers. Not because they loved you. Not even because they feared you. But because forgetting you feels dangerous. Like inviting something in. You, the executioner, become part of folklore. At first, it's just simple tales. Parables told to children who won't finish their lentils. Go to sleep, or the headsman will come, mother's hiss, eyes darting to the window as if you might really be out there, polishing your blade under the stars. Later, the stories grow legs. Suddenly, you're more than just a man. You're a figure. A legend. A cautionary shadow in every cobbled alleyway. The Germans call you der Nachrichter. The French have le bourreau. The English stick to the hangman. So blunt, so literal, so very English. But across all cultures, you come to represent something more enduring than rope or axe. You're the one who walks the line, who stands between the chaos of the mob and the fragile order of the court. And even if people pretend they hate you, they sleep easier knowing someone else is willing to stain their hands for them. Quirky fact, in certain rural towns, especially in Eastern Europe, people believe that executioners have the power to bless or curse crops. Which is awkward, considering you are often banned from touching bread at the baker's stall. You become a figure in woodcuts and church carvings. Sometimes oddly elegant. Sometimes cartoonishly vile. They exaggerate your hood, your hands, your eyes. You never wore a hood in life. Too impractical, too hot. But in art, always. A veil of anonymity, a curtain of dread. Historians still argue whether these depictions were shaped more by popular fear or clerical propaganda. Likely both. Fear sells, after all, and there's no shortage of ink when it comes to horror. And then come the myths. You were 7 feet tall. You had no tongue. You wept before each killing. You laughed after each killing. You spoke to your sword. You danced with the dead. You kept a ledger. You wore boots made of human skin. You once refused to kill a boy who smiled at you. You married the ghost of a nun. None of it's true. Except the last one. Maybe. The people tell stories because they can't stand not knowing. They need reasons. They need meaning. They need to believe that even executioners have rules. Because if you have limits, then maybe the world does too. One of the most persistent tales involves your final execution. Supposedly, it was your own apprentice who beheaded you. That's not uncommon, by the way. Tools of the trade are surprisingly poetic like that. But the tale insists it wasn't just duty. It was revenge. Something about a broken promise. A stolen lover. A misplaced loaf. Depends on who's telling it and how much meat they've had. What matters is that the town had to watch you die just as they'd watched you work. And the legend always ends the same way. When the blade fell, your head landed upright, and your eyes stared straight ahead. No blinking. No fear. Just recognition. As if you saw death coming and greeted it like an old friend. Of course, no one remembers your name in these stories. You become the headsman, the rope walker, the night blade. Your humanity fades. Your smile, your limp, your love of quiet gardens and sour cheese. All gone, replaced by a silhouette holding a curved axe. And maybe that's fair. You chose the work. You built the reputation. You learned to live with the distance. So what if it followed you into legend? But there's a strange honor in it, too. They remember the kings and queens, yes. The saints and scholars, too. But they also remember you. not because you were the loudest, but because you were the last thing someone saw. And that leaves an impression. There's even a village festival once a year where they dress up as old trades, blacksmiths, fishmongers, midwives. And always, someone dons the black cloak and mask, swinging a toy axe and pretending to shout in some guttural gibberish that's meant to sound like justice. Children scream. Parents laugh. Bread is sold. Wine is spilled. And for a moment, the whole village pays tribute to you. Not kindly, but not cruelly either. Just knowingly. Because you were part of the world they built. The silent weight behind their laws. The edge of their safety. And whether they admit it or not, they needed you. They still do. Centuries pass, but you never quite vanish. Not fully. Instead, you echo. In language. In law. In the odd way people still look over their shoulder when walking past certain stones in the square. Executioners may have faded from modern life, but their fingerprints linger. You've recognized the signs. That little iron ring embedded in the churchyard wall? A tether point. Used to secure the condemned before processions. The raised step near the fountain? That's where the block used to sit. Smooth now, but worn in a way that doesn't match its surroundings. You know that where. You made it. You'd be amused by how tidy death has become. Electric lights, quiet rooms, forms filled in triplicate. No scaffolds. No crowds. Just paperwork and size. Historians still argue whether modern justice lost its sense of ceremony or finally found its soul. There's merit to both sides. What replaced you wasn't always better. Just less visible. People still crave spectacle. Now they call it true crime. Documentaries with dramatic music, reenactments, slow-motion close-ups of boots and ropes and folded notes. No blood, of course. Just enough suggestion to keep the popcorn salty. Quirky fact, the phrase "he got the chop" still traces back to your work. So does pulling the plug and even giving someone the axe. Your legacy, oddly linguistic. The old tools, your sword, your block, your noose, or museum pieces now. Under glass, carefully labeled, aggressively sanitized. Schoolchildren walk past, chewing gum and nudging each other, barely looking. But some linger. They stare a little too long at the notch in the wood. The warm grip on the handle. The curve of the blade. You know the look in their eyes. Curiosity. Recognition. A quiet sort of awe. They won't grow up to swing an axe. But they'll remember. They'll wonder. They'll go home and look it up and fall down some digital rabbit hole into your shadowy world. You live there now, too. On the internet. In forums and YouTube rabbit holes. In podcasts with names like Crimson Rope and The Final Step. They interview historians and experts and sometimes just a guy named Dave who once saw a guillotine in Paris and has some thoughts. They get most of it wrong. But the tone? The tone is right. Uneasy respect. Like narrating a ghost story with the lights still on. Your descendants, if they exist, never speak of you. Not directly. You're a branch they prune from the family tree when company visits. But in their bones, in their patience, in their quiet way of watching rooms before speaking, you're there. The modern world makes it easy to forget. To pretend clean hands have always been clean. That law was always noble. That justice was always about truth. But sometimes, quietly, uncomfortably, someone remembers you. In courtrooms, a judge pounds a gavel and declares sentence. They wore robes. They used solemn words. But for centuries, you were the period at the end of their sentence. Not anymore. Now it's appeals and delays and due process. You'd shrug. Fair enough. You weren't perfect. Far from it. But at least you were honest about what the job required. It's strange, isn't it? You who once walked with blood on your boots, who ate apart from others, who couldn't enter taverns through the front door. Now you're an academic subject, a cultural curiosity, a niche interest. There's even a traveling exhibit. The Blade and the Rope, Tools of European Justice. It tours libraries and universities. You're there in every city, silently standing behind the glass, your history flattened into infographics and QR codes. One display is a dummy dressed in your clothes. They added dramatic flair. A red lining to the cloak, a necklace of teeth. Completely inaccurate, obviously. But theatrical. A sign says, the executioner lived on the fringe of society. Feared, vital, and unforgettable. You smirk. They finally got one thing right. The crowd has long since gone. The scaffold's gone too. The wood dismantled, the iron fittings melted down, the platform rotted back into the earth. But echoes have a way of lingering, like footsteps on stones that haven't been walked in years. Like breath on glass long after the mouth is gone. You never wanted fame. But you got kind of immortality instead. The quiet kind. The kind built from repetition. You were remembered not by name, but by shape. A shadow with a blade. A looming figure at the edge of law and life. You've become archetype. In modern films and television, you appear again and again. Hooded, silent, terrifying. A warning in black leather. Often inaccurate, almost always dramatic. Your tools are exaggerated, your emotions erased. No one shows you eating soup, or trimming your nails, or quietly reading psalms after a long day. That's not what they want from you. You're not a person anymore. You're the executioner. Even in video games, you find new work. Gothic castles, medieval dungeons, bloody arenas. There you are, wielding impossibly large axes, stomping toward players with the slow inevitability of a nightmare. Quirky detail. One game designer admitted in an interview that every boss executioner character is modeled on the same early woodcut from Nuremberg. The same bulging shoulders. The same square jaw. The same utterly impossible hat. Historians still argue whether modern depictions of executioners reflect historic reality or a kind of moral displacement. A way to externalize violence, pin it on a single figure, and pretend the rest of society had nothing to do with it. Spoiler, it didn't work then, and it doesn't now. But oh, how the myth persists. Your hood, if you ever wore one, is now a symbol, a cipher, a placeholder for all the things people fear but can't name. Pain, judgment, the final moment. And despite centuries of progress, people still feel something twist in their stomach when they see that shape. Something ancient, something primal, a memory not quite theirs, of watching someone walk up a wooden step, of silence so heavy it hurts, of the sickening knowledge that once the blade falls, something is different, irrevocably. Sometimes, artists try to flip the story. They'll paint you as the reluctant executioner, a tragic figure, the only one willing to bear the weight of death so that others don't have to. You're given a conscience, a secret past, a hidden love for poetry or pet rabbits. Nice sentiment, not totally off the mark either. You did care. You had to, or you would have gone mad. You knew the names of those you executed, their stories, their families, sometimes their guilt, sometimes their innocence. You weren't just swinging metal. You were ending a life. That reality weighs differently than people think. You didn't relish the work, but you didn't flinch from it either. Flinching gets people hurt, and you couldn't afford that. But of course, the world doesn't want gray areas. Not in stories, not in memory. So they paint you black, ominous, other. Because if you are the monster, then maybe the people who hired you aren't. It's comforting in a twisted way, like blaming the knife instead of the hand. But there are moments, odd, quiet moments, when truth creeps back in. A plaque on a wall, a dusty book in a second-hand shop, a visitor at a museum pausing just a little too long by your sword. And in those seconds, someone sees you not as a monster, but as a man. Someone who held a terrible role because someone had to. And in those moments, you almost feel understood. Almost. But only for a breath. Then the world moves on again. Tours resume. Podcasts play. Films roll credits. And you go back to being the shadow behind the curtain. Still there. Still waiting in the wings of history. Because even now, there's a strange, quiet comfort in your presence. Not because people want to see you again, but because they know, deep down, that if chaos ever returned, you would. Not with vengeance. Not with bloodlust, but with a slow, heavy step, a measured hand, a rope tied with care. Because justice, for all its robes and gavels, still needs someone to hold the blade. Sleepy villages don't expect to wake to scaffolds. But when regimes shift, kings fall, or wars end badly, the old rhythms return. And when they do, the world remembers you. You're summoned again. Not you, exactly. But someone like you. A body willing to stand where others won't. There's always someone. In revolutionary France, they called it progress. Equality. Reason. And yet, the guillotine, a machine of cold efficiency, needed a man to pull the lever. Multiple times a day, sometimes. In public squares. To cheers. To gasps. Meet Charles Henry Sanson, a real man, a reluctant executioner. From a long line of them, in fact. He despised the violence, the spectacle, the carnival of death. But he did it, day after day, through the ancient regime and the revolution alike. He beheaded Louis XVI and barely flinched. Not because he hated the king, he served him once, but because the role demanded precision. Dignity. The man had grace under pressure. Quirky fact, Sanson once paused an execution mid-process because the platform was too slippery with blood. Not from squeamishness, he was worried about tripping. One must respect the act, he said. Like it was ballet. Grim, precise ballet. Historians still argue whether men like Sanson were patriots, opportunists, or prisoners of lineage. He didn't ask for the job, but he did it right. It's fascinating, isn't it? When new justice rises, it rarely comes clean. It arrives with fists clenched and slogans screaming. But someone still has to carry out the sentence. And the crowd always returns. A different kind now. Richer in rhetoric, hungrier for change. They demand heads in the name of the people, of progress, of tomorrow. They cheer not because they like death, but because they believe it will cure something. It never does. But in those moments, when the blade lifts high and silence blankets the square, they believe. That's when you step in. Calm, competent, detached. Not for cruelty. For control. The 20th century tried to make you obsolete. Gas, electricity, bullets. Clinical. Efficient. Hidden behind walls. But you lingered still. In the USSR, executioners used pistols. A single bullet behind the ear, often at night. Names whispered. Files burned. But someone still had to hold the gun. Stand over the list. Make the call. In Nazi Germany, the Fallbeil, a brutal beheading machine, was revived. The method changed, but the ritual remained. There was still a name, a time, a hand that pulled the cord. Someone always has to be you. Sometimes, they try to break the mold. In America, they give the role a committee, a warden, a chaplain, a doctor, a switch flipped by multiple anonymous hands. To diffuse responsibility. But even that feels like theater. A play designed to hide the blade. And you, well, you never liked theater. Not when it lies. Back in medieval days, people accepted the role you played. It was ugly, yes. Brutal. But necessary. Like a cauterized wound. Now, the modern world wraps that wound in silk and says, look. No pain. But the scar is still there. And sometimes, it itches. Your legacy becomes a prism. Through it, we see the evolution of justice, power, fear. One man's arm becomes the metaphor for an entire civilization's morality. Because it's not about the axe. It's about the choice. And who is willing to make it. In every era, there's a moment. Just before the sentence is carried out. When everyone breathes in and wonders, are we right to do this? They never ask you. But they always expect you to answer. With action. So you do. Cleanly. quietly, without flourish. Because it's not about spectacle anymore. It's about completion. You are the punctuation mark after law's long sentence. And in every age, when the systems falter, when society teeters, and people begin whispering about justice with clenched teeth and trembling hands, they remember you. The one who didn't flinch. The one who stood still. The one who, for better or worse, got the job done. There's something oddly comforting about rules. Even grim ones. Like how the sword must be sharpened the night before. Or how the block should be sanded smooth so no splinters catch. Or how you always check the rope length twice. It's a ritual, not superstition. Procedure. And now, centuries later, these procedures, your quiet obsessions, have become footnotes in textbooks, dusted off by doctoral students who sip coffee and say things like, well, actually, executioners often refuse to drink before a job, as if they're not talking about life's end. You'd be amused. They think you were cold. But really, you were exact. Because to you, the horror wasn't in the act. It was in the error. The thought of getting it wrong. Of botching it. Of causing unnecessary pain. That's what haunted you at night, not the crowd or the blood. Historians still argue whether early executioners believed they were enacting divine justice or merely performing civic duty. Likely, you didn't care. You just wanted to make sure it was done properly. No fanfare. No mess. No flinching. Let others shout about right and wrong. You had a blade to keep clean. Quirky fact, in some towns, the executioner also served as dog catcher. Same logic, really. Handling what no one else wanted to. Control, removal, silence. Sometimes all before breakfast. You didn't mind. You weren't here to be liked. And yet, beneath all that, beneath the cloak and the mask and the professional detachment, there was something human. Something sore. Loneliness. You didn't get invited to festivals. You didn't sit in the front pews at weddings. You stood just outside the firelight, pretending not to notice when the conversation shifted or the laughter died as you approached. You grew used to it. You even came to prefer the quiet. But every so often, something small would break through. A child would wave. A widow would nod, just once, grateful that you'd ended her husband's pain swiftly. A priest would press your shoulder after a clean execution and whisper, "Mercy comes in many forms." You never spoke of those moments. You just remembered them. They were enough. Enough to keep you steady. Enough to keep you from tipping into the dark. And then one day, it ended. Maybe the laws changed. Maybe your town modernized. Maybe people stopped needing you, or pretended they did. The sword was retired. The axe placed in storage. The block buried or burned or shipped to a museum in a box labeled miscellaneous penal implements. You were given a pension, maybe. Or not. You grew older. Quieter. The townspeople passed you by without fear now, just vague discomfort. Like trying to remember a bad dream from years ago. Some nodded. Most didn't. You faded. Not dramatically. Not tragically. Just slowly. Like ash and wind. And now you're a story. A bedtime whisper. A Halloween costume. A footnote. A curiosity. You live in docusseries, narrations, and horror podcasts. In reenactments with clearly fake beards and overacted groans. In lectures by professors who've never held a sword, never felt a neck go limp, never waited for the silence after the fall. You're sanitized, debated, romanticized, but never really known. And yet, somehow, you're still here. In the corners of museums. In idioms. In the uneasy hush that still falls over modern executions, no matter how far they've buried them behind procedures and walls. You are the echo in the room no one wants to name. The end they don't want to imagine. The job someone still has to do. And while the world builds cleaner ways to end lives, quiet, quick, chemical, you know, deep down, that it's just new paint on old wood. You were honest about what you were. And that, perhaps, is why they remember you. Because in a world full of euphemisms, you were the full stop. Time softens everything eventually. Even memory. Even you. What was once the most feared face in the village has become a costume. A Halloween mask. A stylized villain in cartoons, swinging foam axes at cackling jesters. You get birthday cards now. Well, not you, but your image. Printed in cheap ink with "Have a Killer Birthday" scrawled across a hooded silhouette. You're a punchline. But maybe that's okay. It's better than being forgotten altogether. And besides, history has its own strange rhythm. What goes around, comes back. Not the same, but with a knowing smirk. Like the fact that your old house, the one they forced you to live in just beyond the city gates, is now a coffee shop. Quirky fact, it sells executioner's espresso. Bitter. Overpriced. Extra foam. Historians still argue whether society's playful rebranding of executioners reflects acceptance, repression, or just a need to make peace with its past. Maybe it's all three. Maybe it's just capitalism. You probably roll your eyes at the mugs with skulls on them. But you take your coffee black. Quietly. There's something poetic about how far we've come. And how far we haven't. We have courts and codes and appeals and endless red tape, but in the end, justice still carries a blade. Even if it looks different now. Even if it's swaddled in paperwork and fluorescent lighting. But your legacy isn't really about punishment. It's about responsibility. When others looked away, you didn't. You bore the burden day after day, year after year. You lived on the edge of society so others could sleep more comfortably inside it. You weren't noble. You weren't cruel. You were necessary. And there's a kind of dignity in that. A strange, quiet honor. Sure, people might twist your story. They'll call you monster or martyr or both. They'll exaggerate your muscles or erase your humanity. They'll paint you in shadow or bathe you in drama. Let them. You know who you were. And so do we, now. Not because we celebrate what you did, but because we understand why you did it. Because sometimes the darkest roles belong to the most disciplined hands. And because no matter how civilized we become, someone always has to be the one who stands at the edge. So thank you for your silence, your precision, your patience. And now, as the past slips away and the present drifts into dreams, your shape fades too. Not into obscurity, but into stillness. That calm place between night and morning, between justice and peace, between the last breath and sleep. So now, you let the weight fall away. No more steps to count. No more edges to sharpen. No more names on slips of parchment handed to you with trembling fingers. The crowd is gone. The scaffold is dust. And the torchlight that once flickered against the walls of stone fades into nothing more than the soft hum of your fan in the corner. You lie still now. The cover soft around your shoulders. The darkness gentle, not grim. You've traveled far tonight, walked narrow corridors of memory, and met shadows not easily forgotten. But here, there is no judgment, no rope, no blade. Only the slow rhythm of breath, the faint pulse in your temple, and the tender quiet that follows a long, strange story finally finished. You were never the villain they claimed, nor the hero they feared. You were simply the hand that steadied the final moment. And now you can rest. Let your body sink into the mattress. Let the day slip further behind you, like a torch receding down a tunnel. Let your thoughts grow heavy, your limbs warm, your heartbeat slow and steady as it fades into silence. You are safe now. You are still. And sleep is already waiting just beyond the next breath. Let go. Let go. Let go. End of script. Sweet dreams.